Whispers in the Dark. Chapter 1. London was cloaked in fog, the heavy mist winding through the narrow cobblestone streets like a living thing. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their halos of light swallowed by the dense vapour, leaving the city in a shadowy, half-formed state. Mary Hartwell pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, quickening her pace as she made her way toward the London Gazette. The streets were unusually quiet, even for London at night, but it wasn't the silence that unnerved her. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched. For weeks, Mary had been working late at the Gazette, buried in her exposé on the corruption that ran deep within London's elite. The more she uncovered, the more dangerous her work became. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, like a storm brewing just out of sight. It wasn't just the investigation weighing on her mind, something darker was at play. When she finally reached the doors of the Gazette, she paused. The building stood silent, the usual bustle of late-night journalism absent. Normally, even at this hour, the newsroom would be alive with the sound of typewriters clattering, voices murmuring over deadlines, and the steady hum of life. But tonight, there was nothing. Pushing open the door, Mary stepped inside. The familiar sounds she had expected were gone. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting faint, trembling light over the desks and the scattering of papers. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, and the stillness was almost oppressive. "Mary!" a voice called softly from behind her. She turned to see Charlie Collins, her fellow journalist and closest friend, hurrying toward her, her face pale and drawn. "You need to come with me," Charlie said, her voice shaky. Dread gripped Mary's stomach, a gnawing fear that something terrible had happened. She followed Charlie down the dimly lit hallway, their footsteps echoing off the walls in the unnatural silence. They reached the storage room in the back of the building, where the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air felt thick, as if it were weighed down by something invisible, something malevolent. Mary stopped short as her eyes landed on the scene before her. Two police officers stood over a body lying on the floor, a blanket haphazardly thrown over it. A shiver ran down her spine as she spotted Inspector James Hale, the lead detective from Scotland Yard, standing near the window. His expression was grim, his shoulders tense with the weight of the situation. "Who?" Mary began, her voice faltering as she took in the still form beneath the blanket. "It's Abigail," Charlie whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's dead." The words hit Mary like a punch to the gut. Abigail Monroe, the young typist who had been working at the Gazette for the last few months, now lay lifeless at their feet. But it wasn't just Abigail's death that horrified Mary. It was the eerie resemblance between the two of them. Abigail's dark hair, her slight build, the clothes she wore. It was as if someone had mistaken her for Mary. A cold certainty settled over Mary, chilling her to the core. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random act of violence. Abigail wasn't the target. She was. Chapter 2. A mistaken identity. The wind howled outside Mary's flat, rattling the windows as she sat by the fire, her mind spinning. She stared into the flames, trying to make sense of the events of the evening. Abigail's body, the way it had been found, it wasn't right. It had felt too deliberate, too calculated. The resemblance between her and Abigail had been uncanny, unsettling. Abigail had been killed in her place. But why? Why now? Her thoughts kept circling back to one name, Edgar Blackstone, the younger brother of Victor Blackstone, whose criminal empire Mary had helped dismantle just months ago. While Victor had been a visible force in London's underworld, Edgar had always been the more dangerous of the two. He was calculated, patient, and far more discreet. Since Victor's fall, Edgar had maintained a low profile, but Mary had never believed for a moment that he had simply disappeared. He was too smart for that. She couldn't shake the feeling that Edgar was behind this. And if she was right, that meant he wasn't finished. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Charlie entered, her face still pale from the shock of the day's events. She handed Mary a cup of tea before settling into the chair opposite her. "I've been thinking," Charlie began, her voice low and tentative, "about what happened to Abigail. It doesn't make sense. Why would Arthur Dawes, Edgar Blackstone's footman, kill her? What could she have possibly done to make her a target?" Mary wrapped her hands around the teacup, though its warmth did little to chase away the cold fear gnawing at her insides. "I don't think Abigail was the target," she said quietly. "I think it was meant to be me." Charlie's eyes widened, shock and disbelief flashing across her face. "You think someone tried to kill you?" Mary nodded, her throat tight. "It's the only explanation that makes sense. Look at her, Charlie. She looked just like me. Whoever killed her thought they were killing me." Charlie set her cup down with a trembling hand, her face pale. "But why now? Why would Edgar come after you months after Victor's fall?" "I don't know," Mary admitted, her thoughts racing. "But I can feel it. Edgar is behind this." "But we have no proof," Charlie replied, frustration edging her voice. "Without evidence, the police won't reopen the case. They've already arrested Dawes. They think it's over." "I know," Mary said, her resolve hardening. "But I'm going to find the proof. Edgar won't stop until I'm dead, and I won't stop until I expose him." Chapter 3. Into the Darkness. The following morning, Mary and Charlie set out to investigate Abigail's life. They visited her modest flat in a dingy part of the city, the kind of place where the walls seemed to whisper secrets and the air was heavy with untold stories. The scent of coal smoke hung in the air, mingling with the stale smell of old papers and worn furniture. As they sifted through Abigail's belongings, Mary couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. Abigail had led a quiet, unremarkable life. Her clothes were simple, her books few and well used. A handful of letters from her family back in the countryside were neatly stacked in a drawer, untouched for weeks. There was nothing in her life that suggested she had been involved in anything dangerous, no debts, no enemies, no secret relationships. "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time," Mary muttered, frustration bubbling under the surface. "This wasn't about her. It was about me." Charlie looked up from a small stack of papers she had been reading through. "But if that's true, then Edgar knows you're onto him. He won't stop until—" Her voice faltered, the rest of the sentence hanging in the air like a heavy weight. They both knew what she meant. If Edgar had ordered Abigail's murder, it was only a matter of time before he tried again. And next time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. That thought lingered in Mary's mind as they left Abigail's flat and made their way to Scotland Yard. She needed to speak to Inspector Hale again. She had to convince him that this wasn't over. When they arrived at Hale's office, they found him sitting behind his desk, his face drawn and tired. He looked up as they entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hartwell," he greeted her, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. "What can I do for you?" "I need to know more about Arthur Dawes," Mary said, sitting across from him. "You arrested him for Abigail's murder, but I believe he's just a pawn. Edgar Blackstone is behind this." Hale sighed, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "Miss Hartwell, we have no evidence linking Edgar Blackstone to this crime. Dawes was caught leaving the scene with stolen items in his possession. That's enough to convict him." "But why would Dawes kill her?" Mary pressed, her frustration growing. "He's a footman with no motive to murder a typist. It doesn't make sense." "I don't know," Hale replied, his tone weary. "But without evidence, there's nothing more we can do. Edgar Blackstone is untouchable." Mary's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Then help me find the proof. Reopen the case. Investigate Dawes' connection to Edgar." Hale's gaze hardened as he studied her. "You don't know what you're getting into, Miss Hartwell. Edgar Blackstone is not someone to cross lightly. If you keep pushing, you might not like where it leads." "I'm not afraid of him," Mary said, though her heart raced with fear. She had come too far to back down now. Edgar was dangerous, but if she didn't stop him, no one else would. Chapter 4. The Footman's Trail. The weeks that followed were grueling, filled with long hours of dead-end leads and frustrating dead ends. Mary and Charlie threw themselves into the investigation, determined to find a way to connect Edgar Blackstone to Abigail's murder. It was like chasing shadows. Every time they thought they were getting closer, the trail went cold. They questioned old acquaintances of Arthur Dawes, hoping to uncover something that would link him to Edgar. They sifted through financial records at the Gazette, looking for even the slightest hint of a connection. And they ventured into the seedy parts of the city where Edgar's influence was rumoured to be strongest, talking to anyone who might have information. But Edgar was careful. Too careful. He had erased his tracks so thoroughly that it was as if he had never existed at all. Late one evening, Mary found herself in a smoky pub near the docks, following a lead on one of Dawes's old associates. The man she was meeting, a grizzled dock worker named Frank Morris, sat hunched over his drink, his eyes bloodshot and wary. "You've got some nerve poking around about Arthur Dawes," Morris muttered, not looking up from his pint. "You'd be smart to leave it alone." "I can't," Mary replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I need to know the truth. Did Dawes kill Abigail on Edgar's orders?" Morris snorted, shaking his head. "If you're looking for a confession, you won't get one. Edgar doesn't leave loose ends." "But Dawes was a loose end," Mary pressed, leaning forward. "He was arrested. He took the fall for a crime Edgar orchestrated." Morris's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Mary thought he might get up and leave, but instead he leaned in closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're smarter than I thought, but if you want to stay alive, you'll stop asking questions." Chapter 5. A Deadly Game. The deeper Mary and Charlie dug into Edgar's past, the more dangerous the investigation became. Edgar was always one step ahead, his influence stretching across London like a shadow, always present but never seen. Mary began to feel as though she was being watched at every turn, as if Edgar's eyes were on her, waiting for her to slip. It wasn't long before her fears became reality. One evening, as Mary made her way home through the fog-choked streets, she heard footsteps behind her. At first, she thought it was nothing, just another passerby in the city. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, matching her pace. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickened her steps, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The footsteps followed. Mary darted into a narrow alleyway, her back pressed against the cold, damp brick wall as she struggled to control her breathing. The fog swirled around her thick and heavy, cloaking the street in an impenetrable mist. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, a shadow appeared at the mouth of the alley. A tall, dark figure, his outline blurred by the fog, stood at the edge of the alley watching her. Mary's heart thundered in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to scream. She could only stare as the figure stood there, motionless. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the fog. Mary collapsed against the wall, her legs trembling beneath her. Edgar wasn't just watching her, he was hunting her. Chapter 6. The Breakthrough. Weeks passed and Mary's nerves were frayed, her mind racing at every sound, every shadow that crossed her path. She had to find something, anything that would finally bring Edgar down. She couldn't live like this, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when he would strike next. Then, late one night, Mary finally caught her break. Charlie had been following a financial lead, tracing payments through a tangled web of shell companies linked to Edgar's operations. They had been combing through records for hours when Charlie suddenly sat up, her eyes wide. "Mary, look at this," she said, pointing to a particular set of transactions. Mary moved to her side, her heart quickening as she scanned the document. There it was. A large sum of money transferred from one of Edgar's accounts to an account under the name Arthur Dawes. and the payment had been made just days before Abigail's murder. "This is it," Mary whispered, her fingers trembling as she held the paper. "This is the proof we've been looking for." Charlie nodded, her expression grim. "But Bainbridge and Edgar won't go down without a fight. They have too many connections." "I don't care," Mary said, her voice firm with determination. "We have the proof. We're taking them down." Chapter 7. Edgar's Downfall. Armed with the financial records, Mary returned to Scotland Yard, her heart pounding in her chest. This time Hale listened closely, his brow furrowing as he examined the documents she presented. "These payments link Edgar directly to Arthur Dawes," Mary explained. "He paid Dawes to carry out the murder. Lord Bainbridge funneled the money to make sure it couldn't be traced back to Edgar. But the timing is perfect." Hale's eyes darkened as he looked up from the papers. "You're playing with fire, Miss Hartwell. Going after Edgar and Bainbridge. That's dangerous. They won't go quietly." "I know," Mary replied, her voice steady, "but it's the truth, and it's time they paid for what they've done." Hale studied her for a long moment before he finally nodded. "All right," he said, standing. "We'll reopen the case." The arrest of Lord Bainbridge sent shockwaves through London's elite, but the arrest of Edgar Blackstone was even bigger. 2 days after the financial evidence came to light, Scotland Yard stormed Edgar's estate. Mary watched from a distance as Edgar was led out of his grand home, his face calm and composed despite the handcuffs around his wrists. His sharp suit was immaculate, his hair neatly combed, as if he were going to a business meeting rather than prison. As he was led past her, Edgar's eyes met Mary's, and for a moment he smiled, a slow, cold smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've finally done it, Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice soft but clear. "But remember, this isn't over." Mary watched as he was placed into the waiting carriage, her heart racing. Even in defeat, Edgar Blackstone was still a threat. Chapter 8. Aftermath. The days following Edgar's arrest were filled with news reports and gossip, the London Gazette splashing the story across the front page. But for Mary, the victory was bittersweet. Abigail Monroe was still dead, her life taken because of a terrible mistake. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, the Blackstone influence still lingered, even from behind the bars of a prison cell. She stood by the window of her flat one evening, watching as the fog swirled through the streets below. The city seemed quieter now, as though it too was waiting for something. Waiting for the next move in a game that had not yet ended. Charlie sat beside her, a cup of tea in her hands. "You should be proud, Mary," she said softly. "You brought Edgar and Victor Blackstone down. That's no small feat." "I know," Mary replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But it doesn't feel like it's over." Charlie frowned, setting her cup down. "What do you mean?" Mary sighed, her gaze still fixed on the fog outside. "When Edgar looked at me today, he wasn't defeated. He was waiting for his chance." "You think Edgar and Victor will try something from prison?" "I don't know," Mary admitted. "But the Blackstones are not the kind of men who accepts defeat. As long as they're alive, they're dangerous." The memory of Edgar's smile lingered in her mind, chilling her to the core. He had lost, for now, but she knew deep down that the game wasn't over. Not really. As Mary stared into the mist, she realized that the battle she had fought wasn't truly finished. Edgar Blackstone had fallen, but the Blackstone reach was long, and the shadows of London still hid secrets. For now she had won. But the whispers in the dark told her that the real fight was only just beginning. The end. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Want to be the first to catch new releases? Hit the bell to stay updated. Thank you for listening.